Dear members, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining in today's webinar. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Thomas Höhne-Sparborth, who will talk about sustainable finance. He is working for Lombard Odier since 2019. And as you may remember, we had our economic forum at the embassy in 20th of October, where we talked intensively about the very topic of sustainable finance. The company Lombard Odier is very much involved in looking for sustainability, green finance as maybe another catchphrase. And they also, for example, reported in just recently that in November, Lombard Odier has estimated that about 25% of all large caps are today are a credible trajectory towards alignment with the scenario keeping warming below global warming below 2%. This is, of course, an extreme challenge if you think of what actually came out of the COP26 in Glasgow, where 100 world leaders tried to find better paths and promises to actually stop deforestation, and of course many rules to improve the situation and be able to keep or improve the situation until 2030 and even more in 2050. Now, Thomas Höhne-Sparborth, he's of course reflecting on this in his speech. He has written many articles in the on the internet available on the internet. So please look into that. Some of it is really complex that I couldn't actually understand it all. It's very interesting though when you have a little bit of grip of all the terms there. So I would like with this give the word to Dr. Thomas Höhne-Sparborth to talk about this matter, in particular, of course, focusing on sustainable finance, how we can help by financing worthy projects for nature and for our future. Dr. Thomas Höhne-Sparborth, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and very nice to be with you all today here to talk about this topic, which is indeed a topic we are quite passionate about. So thank you for the invitation as well. As André mentioned, my name is Thomas Höhne. I'm the head of sustainability research here at Lombard Odier. I'm based in London, and indeed we spend much of our time trying to understand sustainability from a financial perspective. Now, I do have a presentation which I will share with you if you give me just one moment. So my presentation to you today is titled Sustainability as an Investment Conviction. And let me just dwell on this title for a moment, because much of my core message is really already encapsulated in the title. There are many ways that you can approach sustainability. Many do it simply as a sanity check. Some do it from a regulatory perspective, from a reporting requirement. We've chosen to approach it from a different angle, as an investment conviction, meaning that we actually believe that an understanding of sustainability is material to us, financially material from an investor perspective. It is material to us because we believe it affects companies' bottom lines, the risk and return profiles of the companies that we invest in. So let me start off by saying what we mean by sustainability and the scope of the challenge that we face today, at least in our opinion. Today, when we look at the economy as a whole, we believe there's not one but a number of problems that we need to address. A lot of the focus currently is, of course, on climate change, on the climate transition, on the climate challenge, but we believe this is part of a much wider challenge. Firstly, we believe the economy is wasteful. We extract over 90 billion tons of material every year from the planet. That's about half the weight of Mount Everest every year, and most of the material is actually wasted. In addition, we believe the economy is idle. If we look at the average car sitting on our driveways, it's idle, not being used around 90% of the time as well. Then, of course, it's lopsided in terms of inequalities that we see in the economy between the global north, between the global south, but also within our societies. And then finally, of course, it is still a dirty economy, not only in terms of the amount of emissions we produce, but also in terms of our wider environmental footprint, in terms of release of toxic materials and other damaging goods to the environment. We consider this economy, as we call it, a wild economy. And we're worried about this as investors because we recognize that all of these dimensions create significant and growing externalities, costs to society and to the environment that we see are increasingly being internalized. They're being integrated into companies' financial performance through regulation, through changes in consumer behavior, and through increased expectations on companies to indeed reform their business models. So we believe the economy needs to transform to one that we call the CLIC economy, one that's circular, lean, inclusive, and clean, and is the polar opposite from the wild economy today. It's also an economy that we believe we are already moving towards at an accelerating rate. If we see the trends emerging from regulation, whether it's new pledges coming out of COP26, whether it's national objectives coming out of the COVID crisis, or whether it's the trend in business technologies or the behavior of consumers, this transition is already in motion, and we believe it's one that's worth investing in. Now, as we try to tackle this challenge, we need to keep in mind that we're talking about a very complex system. Very often we focus on the challenge of climate change, but we recognize this is only one of what are called the 9 planetary boundaries. These planetary boundaries, much like the climate issue, represent systems that need to be maintained for our society to continue to thrive. We live currently in a period that historically and in the geological sense has been phenomenally stable, both in terms of global temperatures, but also in terms of many of the other aspects you see listed here. And today, many of the systems that our society, our environment, and our economy rely on are under threat. Aside from climate change, we're seeing increased pollution flowing into our agricultural soils, for instance. Already today, 1/3 of our soils has been degraded and is no longer as agriculturally productive as it once was. We're also seeing increasing challenges with the use of water. While globally, our water use is still within limits, at a local level, in certain continents and certain regions, we're seeing increased pressures on some of our water systems emerging due to overuse and poor management. And perhaps culminating in all of that is the loss of biodiversity that we're seeing. We've lost about half of our biodiversity since the 1970s, more so in some areas. And this too, we consider not only an environmental challenge, but very much an economic one, once we realize that over half of our economy is directly or indirectly dependent on nature. Now, the concern, of course, is that many of these challenges still today are getting worse. If we look at climate change, for instance, we have already warmed our planet by around 1 degree. If we were to continue along current trajectories, following current government policies, warming would exceed 3 degrees by the end of the century, which by all accounts would be a fairly catastrophic level of warming. So a change in direction is certainly needed to try and limit global warming, but also our impact on some of these other nature dimensions. So let me say a few words about some of the trends that we're seeing, particularly in light of the COP26 conference that's only a few weeks behind us now. At Lombard Odier, we were very present at COP26, and there's many different conclusions we can draw from it. As I mentioned, going into COP26, and if we just look at the trends in the economy today, those would lead us to around 2.9 degrees warming on the upper end. If we look what's come out of COP26, if we take all pledges, all commitments from governments at face value, those would, in theory, be sufficient to limit warming to around 1.8 degrees. That is for the first time within the limits of the Paris Agreement, which sought to limit warming below 2 degrees, but if possible, below 1.5 degrees. At the same time, we also see that if we just look at the near-term targets of countries, those are generally significantly less ambitious. It is sufficient only to limit warming to 2.4 degrees, not that much of an improvement from where we are today, which might be seen as indicative of governments kicking the can down the road, if you will. But still, what we are seeing is a fairly rapid evolution towards alignment with the Paris Agreement. In fact, since COP26, 90% of the world economy, if you look at government pledges, now have some net zero standard, which is up significantly from around 16% just 2 years ago. So we're seeing a rapid and accelerating transition. Now, what I would also highlight from our view is that it's not only government forces and pledges that are driving this. Yes, governments may turn up the speed dial, if you will, but what this has set in motion is a new cycle in the business cycle, if you will. Businesses are now looking at what governments are expecting, how markets are likely to evolve. Investors are interpreting the pledges that have come out of COP26 and are ramping up investments in greener technologies. That in turn shifts the economics of some of these technologies through increased investment, but also economies of scale, growing markets, and growing competition in some of these markets. That brings down the cost of these technologies, enticing more investors. And in the next round of negotiations, this is likely to lead policymakers to ramp up their ambition even further once they see that indeed some of these green transitions are actually much more economic and more palatable than perhaps they considered during the last round of negotiations. And in fact, this process used to be a 5-year cycle where governments would reconvene every 5 years to revisit the pledges they've made. Since COP26, it's been agreed to make this an annual cycle, with the new wave of targets actually going to have to be determined by the end of 2022. So as investors, we need to start addressing how do we then think about this challenge? If 90% of the world economy is indeed moving in this direction, if we're seeing significant shifts of where businesses are allocating their capital, of how markets are shifting, clearly as investors, we need to get ahead of this transition and understand indeed the challenges that it poses for our portfolios, but also the investable opportunities that it might create. And today, we believe as investors or as the market, we're probably looking at the wrong thing. Today, we see that many investors are looking at something that's called a carbon footprint. We look at how high the footprint of our portfolio is, or we look at how high the footprint of a particular company might be. That would tell us something such as that a steel company or a cement company has a higher carbon footprint than a company active in education or healthcare. Now, what we believe is that that shouldn't mean that we simply pool our money out of steel and cement and chemicals and put all of our money in health and education. Why not? Because it's precisely in some of these higher emitting sectors that the most significant carbon reductions can be achieved. If we can indeed find a steel company that is on a rapid trajectory towards net zero, on a credible trajectory to net zero, not only does that deliver more in terms of decarbonizing the economy, we also believe that companies that are able to achieve that can very well deliver major new significant competitive, green competitive advantages to where they are in the market today. So for us, it's less about shifting all of our capital into the lower carbon section of the economy where there isn't that much of the problem, where the problem is perhaps already solved. It is much more for us about taking what we call a forward-looking perspective, looking not at where a company or a portfolio is as of today, but rather whether it's aligned to rapid decarbonization through credible and financially prudent strategies. So what's needed is this more financial and this more forward-looking perspective, also understanding that we're approaching this, again, as investors from a financial perspective. So let me say a few words about that point as well, because it's not only for us about alignment to the transition, not only about understanding which companies are changing their business models, it's also for us about understanding how these companies are going to be affected by that in their bottom lines. And for that, we need to look at a few different dimensions. First of all, we have transitional exposure. And transitional exposure really encapsulates the fact that, as we mentioned, the economy is going to be moving to a lower carbon or net zero economy. And that creates significant risks as well as opportunities. We expect to see significant increases in carbon prices, essentially a tax being put on any emissions produced. We see an intensification of regulation, which may require some sectors to decarbonize at an accelerated rate, it may make some products simply no longer viable for the market. In addition, as some of these companies decarbonize, they will inevitably face a significant capital outlay, abatement costs, the investments in technologies needed to decarbonize. And finally, demand shifts. If we look at dietary changes, the shift from meat-based to plant-based diets is something we're already seeing occurring in different markets as of today. But on the flip side, that also creates opportunities for the products that would replace their brown alternatives today. It can unlock new competitive advantages for those companies that figure out this transition where their competitors do not. And it can also unlock opportunities for new price premiums, where consumers or downstream customers are likely to be willing to pay more in some cases for a greener product to improve their overall footprint and indeed reduce exposure to some of these regulatory challenges. Aside from transitional risks, there's also physical risk. We've heard increasing reports from Australia to California to around the world of wildfires, of flooding. These risks are already with us today, but it will continue to increase. Even in a best case scenario, if the world moves towards net zero by 2050, which today still seems a little bit beyond the ambition of where governments are taking us, that still only gives us a 50% chance that warming will indeed stay below 1.5 degrees. There's also a 50% chance that warming will actually be higher than that, leading to increasing and escalating physical risks that we very much need to be on the lookout for and adapt to in our portfolios, but also adapt to in a physical sense through improved resilience of our infrastructure. And finally, then, there are liability risks. The recognition that some companies may be held liable for either their past contribution to emissions, their current ongoing emissions, or simply their failure to adapt their infrastructure. The Biden administration has recently pegged the cost of carbon at $51 per ton. Now, if we multiply this amount by the cumulative amount of emissions that's emitted every year, and it's some 40 billion tons per year, or 50 billion tons if we look at all GHG, that leads to a significant liability risk. Of course, it depends on to what extent the courts will indeed uphold some of these claims. Many of these cases are today before the courts. These cases are being tested. So as of today, this still represents a large unknown to investors and to the economy as a whole. But it's certainly one of the risks that we need to be aware of and take account of as we do our risk assessments in our portfolios. So I've spoken then about the need to not only take a forward-looking perspective to understand financial exposure, but I haven't commented yet on how we actually assess which companies then to invest in. And to do that, we've had to develop new capabilities. And one of these is what we call an implied temperature rise assessment. Now, this sounds a little bit complex, but if you think back to a few slides when I showed you the level of global warming that would result from current government pledges on 1.8 degrees, if we take all of these pledges at face value, that assessment is an implied temperature rise metric. It tries to assess, based on the level of ambition of government policies, comparing that to different climate scenarios, the level of global warming that would likely result. Now, that same assessment can be done not only at the level of the economy as a whole, but also at the level of our portfolios, of individual sectors, and even of individual companies. And we do that by first trying to define exactly how quickly every industry can and needs to decarbonize to be aligned with a given level of global warming. To achieve the goal of 1.5 degree alignment, for instance, many companies on average need to reduce their emissions by about 50% as early as 2030, reducing their emissions nearly to net zero by 2050. Once we have that understanding, and I need to be quite specific here that this understanding may very well vary from one sector to the next, as some sectors can decarbonize faster than others, we then need to compare to where an individual company is headed. Is a company already decarbonizing in line with what can and needs to be achieved? And if we look at some of the targets and commitments that those companies have set and the credibility of those targets, is that company indeed likely to manage its emissions, to reduce its emissions in line with what needs to be achieved, or is it going to fall short? Now, based on that assessment, both of where a company is headed and where it needs to be headed, we can translate this once again into an implied temperature rise figure, essentially reflecting the level of global warming that would result if every company in the economy were to be managing its emissions with a similar level of ambition. Now, this adds a new dimension to our analysis. Rather than just looking at the carbon footprint of a portfolio, which I show here on the vertical axis, we now also add this forward-looking dimension on the horizontal axis. So this tells us not whether a company is high emitting or low emitting, but whether those emissions are being managed in an appropriate manner. Now, when we combine this, we end up with some very interesting categories from an investment perspective. In the top right, we have a category that we call burning logs. These are companies that are essentially on fire, a huge amount of emissions, and very much emissions that are still moving in the wrong direction. But in the top left, we have an interesting category that today is neglected by the market, a category that we call ice cubes, because they cool down the economy. These are companies that are actually also in high emitting sectors, perhaps in steel, perhaps in cement, perhaps in the automotive sector, the power industry, but rapidly decarbonizing. It's precisely those companies, because they're in high emitting sectors, that we believe are most relevant to the transition. And if they can indeed figure out a credible strategy to decarbonize, are perhaps best positioned for the future ahead. So again, from a financial perspective, some of these categories are very material to us. These burning logs, these companies with high emissions moving in the wrong direction, we believe are very exposed to the possibility of stranded assets, assets that perhaps simply will no longer be able to remain in production. Also to brand damage. Consumers may move away from higher emitting companies that are failing to mitigate their footprint. Similarly, we're seeing significant shifts in demand within the energy system, within the food system, within other sectors, that companies that are failing to transition will be on the wrong end of. Companies that are failing to transition, we fear, will be put at an increased competitive disadvantage and ultimately will simply lose the license to operate. In contrast, these ice cubes, we believe, are well positioned to take advantage of the transition, to leverage their improved pricing power as they develop a new competitive advantage and are likely to be rewarded both by regulators and by consumers. In addition, there's an interesting category that we call solution providers. We recognize that as part of this transition, a major ramp-up will be needed in green technologies, in green solutions, in green services. This ranges from everything from energy efficiency solutions to the batteries that go into our electric vehicles, to renewable energy equipment and many other technologies. It's these solution providers that are perhaps best exposed to this transition, but identifying them can often still be challenging, since many of these opportunities are perhaps not found in the end product, the final maker of the wind turbine, but perhaps also in their wider upstream value chain, where many hidden opportunities can still be found. And then finally, of course, there's still a category of companies that we would consider insulated from the transition. These are still very much companies that we would like to continue to invest in. Companies in education, in healthcare, may have a lower carbon footprint. We do not believe, as I mentioned, that we should tilt all of our portfolios into these sectors, but we do want to continue to invest in them because, like these higher emitting sectors, they remain an essential part of the economy. So what this gives us then is, again, a different way of thinking about our portfolios and where they need to be headed. Today, many investors will simply compare the level of their carbon footprint in a portfolio to that of a given benchmark. And that might tell you often that your emissions are a little bit lower than the benchmark. That is in at least the approach many investors have taken. But really what matters for us is whether these emissions are going to go further down over time. And it's through these assessments that I've been describing, these forward-looking metrics, such as implied temperature rise, that we can start to try and assess whether emissions are indeed starting to fall and starting to fall quickly enough to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And that is certainly needed because as we look at most common indices today, if we look at common benchmarks, in many cases, those emissions today are still on the wrong trajectory, moving up rather than moving down. So the challenge then for us becomes to start to redeploy our capital in a manner aligned to this transition, but to do so in a manner that's scalable, that can allow us to redeploy large amounts, the vast majority of sustainably minded capital, in a manner that is indeed supportive and well aligned to this transition ahead. And as Andre mentioned in his introduction, that is not quite as easy. Indeed, we put out some weeks ago estimates that today only 1/4 of large caps is aligned to the Paris Agreement, meaning keeping temperature below 2 degrees. An even smaller percentage of around 6% is today aligned to keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement. Now, I should mention that we do take a conservative view to the statements and targets of companies. We do not believe that a company that sets a net zero target is automatically net zero aligned, unless it indeed also has near-term, medium-term targets, unless it has a credible governance structure to indeed follow through on these commitments, unless it has also figured out how it's actually going to be delivering on this, and has realigned its capital investment plans to that. So if we take all of that into account today, only a small share of the real economy, and therefore of the companies we can invest in, is already aligned to this trajectory. Now, as investors, that poses a challenge, because if we as investors want to realign our portfolios, we can either choose to deploy all of our capital only in the 6% part of the economy, but that leaves behind much of the larger share of the economy, the remaining 94%. We believe actually as investors, we also need to continue to invest in this remaining 94% of the economy, but gradually try to bend the curve on these, try to increase the level of ambition that these companies that we're investing in are pursuing, to try and bring a larger share of the economy into alignment. Because ultimately, this transition to net zero can only be achieved if the economy as a whole transitions, not only a subset of it. Today, there's still a lot of confusion about this in the market. Indeed, the Carbon Disclosure Project quite recently estimated that only 1% of funds are today aligned to the Paris Agreement. And based on my previous slide, that is very much, we believe, in line with what you would expect to see, given that so few of the investable assets in the real economy are already aligned. We do not believe it makes sense to shift our capital only to the names that are already aligned without taking account of the remaining portion of the economy as well. And that becomes an even larger challenge when we consider the scale of the challenge involved. As part of the COP26 conference, a new umbrella alliance was formed that was called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which encapsulates initiatives such as the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative or the Net Zero Banking Initiative. Now, together, some 130 trillion in assets owned or managed have been pledged towards this alliance. And what this figure really represents is the amount of capital where the managers and owners are trying to start to take into consideration this transition towards net zero. But this represents a significant chunk of all financial assets in the market today. So if we have the challenge of deploying $130 trillion in a manner aligned to the net zero transition, then it becomes very clear that that cannot be deployed only in that 6% portion of the economy that's already aligned, and will have to be invested in the wider section of the economy, where the challenge then becomes raising the level of ambition in the economy as a whole. So for us, it's really less about pouring all of the world's sustainably minded capital into this small subset of the economy than it is about bringing the remaining of the portion of the economy with us along in this transition. And one of the ways that we have available to us is through engagement and stewardship. Often what we are now able to do, because we have a sense of where companies' emissions are headed, we believe, we can also engage companies on this with some of these new data points, demonstrating to companies that firstly, they are often less aligned than some of their competitors in the market, demonstrating that indeed companies that have taken more ambitious steps forward are often able to either unlock new markets, regulatory advantages, price premiums, or gain market share. We often can also share our thoughts on some of the strategies that companies may pursue to indeed transition in a manner that's financially sound and will allow these companies to remain profitable even in a net zero future. So it's through those active intervention that investors, not acting alone, but often acting in unison with the backing of alliances, such as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, can start to bend the curve on companies' emissions. That is not something that the financial industry can do alone. It has to be done together with policymakers, together with consumers, but certainly we can lend our voice to this transition. So the challenge here becomes this: taking this small portion of the economy that's already aligned and growing that into a much larger share, both by virtue of the companies that are already aligned, gaining market share, but also increasing the membership of this privileged portion of the economy that is indeed starting to move in the right direction. That ultimately, we believe, will be the only way that the economy at scale can move towards net zero. So this is the end of my presentation. I hope this has been of use to you, and I would be very grateful to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Dear Thomas, thank you very much for your insights into the topic. I will now lead the Q&A. We indeed already received a few questions, and dear participants, if you have any questions or you come up with additional questions now during the Q&A, please feel free to just put them in the chat and we will take on as many as we have time for. The first question was currently, so it's what we've been hearing the past few years, especially, is it's the young generation that starts raising their voice for climate change, well, against climate change, to take up measures and do something about the whole situation. But it's mainly, well, it's a different generation who is in charge of the investments and mainly the decisions, because, well, 2050, 2030 even is quite still far in the future. So what would you say to encourage companies, well, decision makers at a generation that will probably not live to 2050, to encourage them still to invest and not just depending on, well, brand image or consumer market functions that will make their brand more successful if they go green?
Of course, thank you very much for that question. It's a very relevant question. Look, when we talk about climate risks, the intuitive risk that people often think about are these physical risks. And physical risk, it's true, will indeed escalate over a longer time frame. Yes, they're already with us today, but some of the worst effects will indeed only be felt later in the second half of the century. But these transitional risks are actually unfolding as of today. We're seeing today in the market a repricing occurring in terms of green versus brown assets. We've seen car companies, for instance, already having gone through a radical repricing, not necessarily because these companies are already, as of today, suddenly starting to produce electric vehicles. Some of the companies that have been rewarded by the market are companies that are saying by 2030 or by 2035, we're now only going to be producing electric vehicles. Now, even though that transition will only be completed by 2030 or 2035, the repricing in the market is playing out as of today. We've seen those same trends happening in the power sector. We believe that some of these other sectors that I've spoken about, steel, cement, chemicals, will be next up. And the reason for that is because regulators indeed are now moving towards this. I cannot emphasize enough that 90% of the world economy has committed towards this. This means that we will start seeing increased carbon prices. It means that investors are pricing these expected carbon prices into their pricing models and starting to see which companies come out on top on the basis of that. So these transition risks are happening today, which brings the time horizon into alignment with where we need to be.
Thank you very much. You mentioned again and again, yeah, also companies that, or like sectors that are not mainly in the consumer market, but more business to business, or like depending on governmental offers or like projects like steel, like cement. So these sectors are in a kind of monopoly situation, like no matter what price they ask for their products, governments will have to buy from them. What would you say, like, is their interest in reducing their emissions?
Sure. So the steel sector is an interesting example. We're now seeing within the steel sector some significant differences already starting to emerge between companies that are making a strategic bet on indeed transitioning more rapidly and developing the technologies needed to do so. We've had the first ton of carbon neutral steel produced this summer. Of course, today that still comes at a significant cost, but it's these companies that are investing in it early on that we believe will ultimately be the most competitive in these technologies. Now, other companies may choose not to do so, and indeed take a bet that this transition is going to fall flat, that governments are going to run out of steam. We do not believe, our house view is that that is unlikely to happen. And we believe that the more likely scenario is that these companies that are transitioning earlier on in these sectors are actually going to be gaining significant market share from their competitors. And a reason for that is also that although these are not consumer sectors, they are in the supply chain of consumer sectors. One of the major trends we've seen in the market is that companies are no longer held to account only for their direct emissions, but for their supply chain emissions. That's why we've seen major manufacturers, for instance, some major electronic firm, mobile phone manufacturers, becoming very insistent that their supply chains as well start to decarbonize. If as an upstream company, not consumer facing, you fail to decarbonize, you face a very real risk of being locked out of some of these major customers' supply chains. And indeed, many of them have said precisely that.
Thank you very much. Just a question from a totally different angle. How much will blockchain technology and actually the accountability of how big the efforts are in decarbonization upstream in the supply chain play a role in the future?
It's a good question. I have to say I'm not a blockchain expert. I may own a few Bitcoin or fractions of that, unfortunately, but I'm not an expert beyond that. But of course, it is a challenge we're seeing. And what we're seeing, interestingly, even in that market, is again a focus on climate. We've seen some major concerns about the energy footprint, for instance, of Bitcoin. And as part of that, we've seen a shift as to where Bitcoin is actually being mined. We've seen some shifts from China to the US. We've seen some Bitcoin miners actually pledging to go green, again recognizing that this is probably going to remain material to their business model, and also it probably creates opportunities for competition to alternative forms of cryptocurrencies that are less energy intensive. So again, we see even in this market that these green considerations are already playing out as of today and shifting the way the market works and the way certain assets are priced.
Yeah, and well, at the end of the day, what investments are usually all about is, in the end, the return on the investment. So many of our member companies actually are SMEs or like not the big investors. How can they make sure that their investments or where they put their money has some effect in the right direction?
Sure. So when we speak to companies, when we engage with them, what we encourage them to undertake is a study of exactly how they can decarbonize, what the different routes towards decarbonization might be. And often those might come from quite unexpected corners. What we would then expect companies to do is to try and understand exactly the cost of all of those technologies and understand where they can most cost efficiently, as of today, start abating their emissions. And sometimes that might come from investing in technologies, to invest down the line in more renewable energy and energy efficiency and carbon capture, even in hydrogen. It may also come from a rethink in your business model, simply moving from a very product-based model to perhaps more service-based models or alternative forms of delivery. Sometimes a more creative rethink is needed. And in fact, the steel industry that we spoke about earlier is a very good example of that. One way to decarbonize the steel industry is precisely through some of these technologies that I mentioned. The other way to decarbonize the steel industry is for some steel companies to rather begin to leverage their material science, their engineering understanding, to help their customers actually consume less steel. And yes, that might affect the sales of your traditional business model, since you'll be selling less steel. But you'll probably be selling steel that's of a higher grade, the higher premium, where you might have more IP, and it'll be backed up by the unlocking of a new business model in the delivery of engineering services, or perhaps even the equipment needed to deliver on some of these objectives. But certainly that requires a more fundamental rethink of the business models of some of these companies.
And probably also a much larger share of initial investments to invest in those alternative technologies into new business models.
I would say it probably takes more of an investment in your business culture and your organization than necessarily the financial one. In fact, some of these alternative routes to decarbonization, dematerialization, as we would call it, is probably one of the lowest cost routes to decarbonization, but it's more difficult for companies because it requires them to change their mindset. And that is where we as investors try to make a difference by speaking to these companies and indeed showing cases of companies that have successfully transitioned, and also showing cases of companies that have not transitioned in the same way when these major transitions happened.
Yeah, you're mentioning a very important other aspect to all of this, the whole company culture. And well, in Japan, well, at least we have a lot of companies that have been around for decades, if not for centuries. And sometimes the mindset is still like what's been working for the past century will also be working in the future. So there is still a lot of work to do in terms of mindset, in terms of seeing the urgency of the situation. How can we as business leaders try to change this company culture? Of course, we're not expecting that you teach us now in 2 minutes, but just like some keywords on this.
I think it's precisely because some of these companies have been around for such a long time that what they are seeing now should be familiar to them. This is not the first time we've seen a technological transition occur. In fact, during one of my last presentations, I showed two pictures of New York City, one in 1900, one in 1910. In 1900, there were only horse and cart on the road and one motor car. 10 years later, the picture is exactly the opposite. You only see motor cars and you only see one horse and cart. That too was an example of a technological transition. We've also seen more recently transitions from traditional cameras to digital cameras. And, you know, we've had major companies in Japan having been caught out by that. So the concept of technological transition, the fact of one technology being overtaken by a technology that is demonstrably superior and ultimately lower cost, is one that should be familiar. And if we look at it from a different perspective, we've also seen examples of substances simply being phased out. If we've been around for indeed 100 years, as some companies have been, then we've seen transitions such as the move away from lead, which used to be considered a very useful industrial material. We've seen a move away from asbestos, very similar, where it used to be seen as a very useful building material. Now we're seeing yet another transition where we're recognizing that carbon dioxide is simply the next material that will be phased out of our economy. So if anything, that longer institutional memory should be a strength to companies if they're willing to learn the lessons from those past transitions.
Thank you. So we've been talking a lot about now the climate aspect only and the whole temperature aspect of the climate change to come and what we're expecting. Can you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that this whole globe with the 9 different aspects. Can you maybe add a few words on other aspects, not just the temperature and climate?
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. Indeed, today, climate change is forefront at investors' mindsets. We do believe many of these other environmental challenges are lurking not that far behind. They're the elephant in the room, if you will. What we are trying to do and what needs to be done by the market is to adopt that same forward-looking perspective for these other challenges. When it comes to water, for instance, there's many parallels to be drawn to emissions. Once again, we need to understand not only how much water a certain business model is reliant on, but also whether that company is aware of those challenges and has put a credible strategy in place to start to reduce that footprint, particularly if it's operating in areas where that water is or is increasingly becoming scarce. And the same is true for each of these other dimensions. When it comes to agrochemicals, we understand that some companies in the food industry, for instance, need to start rethinking their business models, which may involve a rethink of the products they're investing in, the products they're selling. It also involves a rethink of some of the business practices that they or their supply chains rely on, because if they do not, they will be faced with many of the exact same economic, regulatory, and consumer risks.
So in the end, if a company wants to reduce and be the good student in terms of all those aspects, basically the only solution would be closing down the business. What would you say to that?
No, I would fully disagree with that. Look, this is not about understanding that some companies have a higher footprint and therefore that they need to shut down their business. We recognize that some of the sectors that we've spoken about will even continue to produce a small amount of emissions in the future. What's relevant about all of these transitions and the pathways that are being developed is that they need to be informed by the science. And what's being asked of companies is to do what needs to be done, but still only to do what can be done. There is a recognition when I spoke earlier about some of these implied temperature rise metrics that some sectors can decarbonize at a faster rate than others. So yes, if you're a power company, you will probably be expected to produce absolutely no emissions by 2050. If you're a steel company, it's likely you're not going to be able to achieve that final goal. You may offset some of your final emissions using carbon offsets. If you're an airline industry, you're in a similar situation. So there's a recognition that some companies will have a footprint. And when it comes to water, a water footprint is fine, provided that your water, your wastewater, is appropriately managed, that you recycle that back into the system. So as long as it's part of a circular system, it's perfectly fine to use some of these resources. They just need to be managed in a way that's environmentally and economically sound. And I cannot reiterate enough that in our minds, those two things are the same. If you do not manage things in a way that is environmentally sound, you are in effect creating an externality on society. And what we're seeing is that that externality is starting to be internalized through regulation or through consumer behavior. So that cost is already in the system. We have to realign our business model to take it out.
Thank you very much. And well, we have also heard a lot about ESGs at the economic forum that Andre also mentioned in his opening remarks. So it's not just about the environment and the planet itself, it's also about social goals like inclusion and equal rights and all these aspects. How are you integrating this part of the company culture or the portfolio?
Yeah, it has been a major topic during COP26 as well. There's a recognition that the transition doesn't just need to be ambitious, or it also needs to be just and fair. For instance, if you have a plant that's quite polluting, but generating many or the only jobs in a given area that's not so economically advanced, does it really make sense to shut down that plant, or is an alternative solution needed? And this is certainly also where financing needs to play a role, and perhaps where there's some support to be given from the global north to the global south. We've seen an example, for instance, of South Africa receiving an $8.5 billion deal to close down in an accelerated fashion some of its coal power in the country, recognizing that this is actually, economically speaking, a sensible thing for the global north to do, because it's one of the cheaper ways to actually take a large chunk of emissions out of the economy. But it's also a means of making some of these transitions more palatable. So certainly we need to think about this on a macroeconomic scale, understand where emissions can be most economically reduced and who might ultimately be financing that in a way that's economically and financially optimal, but also socially sound.
Very much. We also had in Japan lately was every now and then again on the news that, well, basically the energy sector in Japan is, well, used to be a lot of nuclear plants, but while there was a lot of investments into coal plants abroad. So it looks very clean on one hand, where it might be not as clean on the other hand. And you mentioned also in the beginning about the whole transparency and all of that. So of course, not just on a governmental scale, but the company scale. How can you be sure, or how can you see from the outside, like how much the companies are actually doing from what they're claiming to be doing?
Good questions. There's a few in there actually. I mentioned earlier that there's been a trend of holding companies to account not only for their own emissions, but also their supply chain and their downstream emissions. The same is now true also for countries, where indeed there's a recognition that countries cannot just decarbonize by moving their exports to another country, but actually need to decrease their overall carbon footprint. That recognition is grown, and one of the examples of that is that one of the pledges that's been signed during COP26 had 40 countries signing onto a coal pledge to not only phase out coal in their own countries, but to cease investment in coal abroad. And we've seen some major countries, including China, sign on to ceasing to invest in coal overseas. When it comes to the question of verification, this is potentially one of the most exciting areas we're seeing develop today. So far, tracking emissions has depended on self-reporting, either by countries or by companies. Very quickly, it's moving to direct observation, where actually satellites are being used to directly monitor the emissions coming out of key assets. You can see an oil and gas refinery or any other site and see the kind of emissions that are coming out of it and quantify those year on year. And that is a very powerful new tool in this transition, but it also makes this challenge more urgent for companies because they simply can no longer hide. It's plain for everyone to see from space.
Thank you very much. So maybe just one last question. We're running out of time for this Q&A session. We've heard a lot about the larger scale, but maybe one final sentence, one final point on what can everyone and each of us do to generate a greener future, a better future for all of us?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, this change requires both technological investment and it requires behavioral changes. And what's encouraging is that we've seen some of these behavioral changes that are needed play out even over the last 2 years, over the course of the pandemic. Skeptics around climate change used to say that, look, behavioral change is impossible. Markets move too slowly. Governments will never change their mind quickly enough. Well, during the pandemic, we've seen major behavioral changes happen. We've stopped flying. We've started holidaying more locally, at least in Europe. We've started massively working from home, essentially overnight, demonstrating that some of these changes are possible. The same changes might be needed in dietary changes. That is perhaps as an individual where we can make the largest single change, simply moving from meat-based to plant-based diets. But there too, technology and business opportunity plays a role. By offering consumers more palatable, tastier alternatives, that transition becomes a lot easier. These days, I prefer a plant-based burger to a meat-based burger. I actually think they taste much better. So technology does play a role, and that creates new business opportunities as well. Again, during my presentation, I emphasized this isn't just about downside risk. It's very much about some of the upside opportunities that are available out there for those companies that recognize the transition for what it is, recognize that this is where a very large portion of the world is moving to at a very rapid rate, and realizing that it's worth investing in to unlock precisely those kind of opportunities.
Right, I would say that's a perfect statement to close this Q&A session. Thank you very much for your time to also answer the question, for your great insight during your presentation, and especially also for getting up very early for us. I assume in London it's still quite early in the day. Wish you all a very nice evening or a great day wherever you are on the planet. And thank you very much for joining today. I hope to see you soon at the next event. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.